Ariadasa. And it is just fantastic, actually, to see so many people in the hall and to see so many people on Zoom as well. A real sense of the richness and friendliness and wonderfulness of our Sangha here tonight. So, as Ariadasa said, I'm talking about death and rebirth in the life of the Buddha. So you could say, perhaps, that the Buddhist life is about surfing impermanence. So it's surfing as in surfing waves, okay? Because everything changes, including ourselves, of course. And either we can just be caught up in those waves of change that take hold of us and then just throw us about in the sea and dump us on the rocks. Or we can learn to ride those waves of change, skillfully working with the laws of karma, so that we can create a person where we can have a healthy pride in, someone who can act in line with our ideals. And you could say that the first person in this age that we live in this kind of era we live in, the first surfer, the first person who discovered how to do that is the Buddha. He found a way to enlightenment himself, and then he woke up, and then he communicated to other people. And it's still being communicated to us, all 2,500 and a bit years later, which is quite amazing. Many hundreds of thousands, millions of people have benefited from the Buddha's waking up and his communication of that. And many people have become enlightened or made progress towards enlightenment. So what is this enlightenment that we're talking about? So we're going to have a look at this today, at some of what's involved in enlightenment, through the story of the life of the Buddha. So it's the big one today, enlightenment, and it's a bit of a shame because one of my favourite parts of whenever anyone gives a talk is where they talk about their own experience of the thing they're talking about. And so sadly today I can't go, well, when I was enlightened, and then it all just kind of went like this, and ever since then I've just been living, anyway, I can't say all that. So I'm more, relying on what other people have said. And as Ariadasa said, the context of this talk is our series on the 5 aspects of the spiritual life. So you'll remember what they are, hopefully, now. So we've got integration. We bring all those scattered parts of ourselves together. We bring the unconscious into the conscious. We bring into the light the dark parts of ourselves so that we can have a sense of agency in the world. We know that if we say we'll do something, well, we'll be able to do it. We can understand our own past conditioning, what drives us to behave in the ways that we do. We can just understand ourselves much more. There's also positive emotion, which is where we develop enough love, metta, faith, compassion, kindness, which allows us to support the whole process of spiritual growth and others as we change. And developing these 2 aspects, the integration and positive emotion, is what allows us to become what Sangha, who's the founder of Triratna, what he calls becoming a happy, healthy human being. And many of us are not happy, healthy human beings. Many of us are, bear the scars of past trauma, of conditioning, of just being human. And it might be the work of many years of practice, many years of friendship, of meditation, of healing, before we become a reasonably happy, healthy human being. And it's only then, when we've got a strong sense of who we are, and when we're happy with who we are to some extent, that we can let go of that self, so we can enter into what we call spiritual death and rebirth, which is what I'm talking about today. And then next week, Bodhi and I will talk about receptivity. So spiritual death can sound strong. And last week in the group, somebody was saying to me how strong it sounded to them. Death is a word, of course, with really frightening implications. But, as we all know, for growth to happen, we have to let go of former selves. I mean, at the moment, I've got my little sunflower seeds are growing like mad, and they've stopped being sunflower seeds and they've turned into baby plants. And it's like if they'd stayed being sunflower seeds, they wouldn't be able to one day be huge, great sunflowers, hopefully, in the autumn. And there's all, you'll know the other kind of images, the metaphors that people use. An acorn has to give up being an acorn in order to become an oak. And of course, the really most amazing one, I think, is the caterpillar that turns into a butterfly and becomes something completely different. But you have to let go of something for something else to arise. You have to pull out all the kind of dead wood of last year in order for the new bits of the garden to grow. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about spiritual death. It's letting go of what doesn't serve us anymore, which doesn't help us anymore, old habits. We might have views that we realize that aren't accurate anymore, letting go of those. And that's what last week Dharma Mai was talking about those. She gave that really lovely talk. They gave that really lovely talk about small spiritual deaths, leaving an old self behind, stepping into these larger shoes. And today it's about the big enlightenment of the Buddha. So at the time of his enlightenment, the person who had been known as Gautama, as Siddhartha Gautama, well, he died and the Buddha was reborn. And the Buddha is a title. It's not a name really, and it means the awakened one, or the one who knows, who understands. So the old Gautama had to die in order for the new Buddha to arise. So what is enlightenment? Well, the Buddha didn't say much about it actually, and that might have been partly because of our tendency to speculate and then to think we know. So we kind of get an idea of what it might be, and then we think, oh, that's it. And actually having that idea is the very thing that stops us from growing. So he did quite a lot of saying what it wasn't. But he did give some hints, some kind of images, which someone's gathered together. These are all from the Pali Canon, the earliest writings that come from the Buddha. And I'm just going to read those out so you get a sense of it. So some of the phrases are the harbour of refuge, the cool cave. That's quite funny because I looked that up on the internet and I got all these pictures of really cool caves. Really funny. Anyway, the cool cave. The island among the floods, the place of bliss, emancipation, liberation, safety, the supreme, the transcendental, the uncreated, the tranquil, the home of ease, the calm, the end of suffering, the medicine for all evil, the unshaken, the ambrosia, the immaterial, the imperishable, the abiding, the further shore, the unending, the bliss of effort, the supreme joy, the ineffable, the detachment, the holy city. So those are some of the phrases from the Pali Canon. So now I'm just going to look at, in more detail, at the story of the Buddha's enlightenment. So Dharma Mai left us last week where the Buddha had stopped his ascetic practices. So ascetic practices are those where you try and put your body through very grueling, almost torturous experiences. But he realized they weren't getting anywhere. So, he'd starved himself till he was very just like rib cage. He'd hardly slept. He's put himself in the kind of, in the sun and by the fires. So he tortured his body. And he was the most intense ascetic there was. So he was like the one who went furthest in all the ascetic practices. He was known for that. But what he found was, what he said was, I thought, whenever a monk or Brahmin has felt painful, racking, piercing feeling due to striving, it can equal this but not exceed it. But by this grueling penance, I have attained no distinction higher than the human state, worthy of the noble one's knowledge and vision. Might there be another way to enlightenment? So basically he's saying he's done whatever he could in terms of the ascetic practices. He's done them all, but actually he hasn't felt anything more than just the state of being human and presumably suffering quite a lot. And so he asked himself, might there be another way to enlightenment? And that's another example of him letting go of something when it doesn't work. There's like a spiritual death there, isn't there? It's like he's really become like the king of the ascetics, really admired for that, but he's prepared to let it go. And what he says is, I thought of a time when my Shakyan father, that just means his Shakyan father means from the tribe of the Shakyans, when my Shakyan father was working and I was sitting in the cool shade of a rose apple tree, quite secluded from sensual desires, secluded from unwholesome things. I had entered upon an abode in the first meditation, which is accompanied by thinking and exploring, with happiness and pleasure born of seclusion. So what he's describing there is a time when, as a boy, people think maybe his father, who was a kind of the chieftain at that time of the Shakyan tribe, was doing some kind of annual ritual of ploughing the fields, getting them ready, and that the young Gautama was sitting under the tree, and he had an experience of what we would call the first dhyana, which is a sense where your mind is very calm, doesn't have any distractions, very relaxed, absorbed, deeply pleasurable state. And he just naturally fell into that. And then the Gautama asks himself, why am I afraid of such pleasure, he wondered. It is pleasure that has nothing to do with sensual desires and unwholesome things, he thought. That is what is causing so much fear. So from this, I guess that like doing all those ascetic practices maybe were partly coming from a fear that by experiencing pleasure, he'd be caught up in that kind of in a cycle of craving. But what he's saying is that there's this very human experience of pleasure, which we can all experience. Sometimes I think it's probably the very same state that people talk about as flow. So it's a state you might get in if you're creating something, if you're running, maybe in meditation. This very human experience. And he realized that in this state, it's a very flexible state of mind. So instead of your thoughts thinking you, it's a state where you can actively reflect on what you want to reflect. So you can choose what you want to do with your mind. And he thought, okay, well, maybe this could be the start for me of moving towards enlightenment. So again, there's a spiritual death there. He's let go of his idea of how he had to practice and gone with his intuition about this experience underneath the rose apple tree. So he accepted some food, some rice pudding. It was actually special Indian rice pudding, very nice. And he sat down. He found this very beautiful tree by the bank of a very beautiful river. And he sat down under there and he made a vow. And the vow was to sit there until he attained enlightenment. Whatever happened, he was just going to sit there until that happened. So he started to allow his mind just to sink into that state of mind that he'd experienced under the rose apple tree. And so everything was looking pretty good. He's like, very beautiful place, great conditions, everything's looking great. But then suddenly from nowhere, he was attacked by a huge army of strange and terrifying monsters, sort of half creatures, half dragon, half cat, some people with the face of a monster, firing arrows at him, shouting at him. People were shouting him, get out of there, while you can, get out of there. So this army was called Mara's army. And Mara is a figure all through Buddhism who represents the kind of personification and embodiment of whatever gets in the way of enlightenment. So Mara has created this whole army who've come and are attacking the Buddha. They're throwing arrows at him and spears at him. But the Buddha just stays very still. And as the arrows and the spears come towards him, they turn into flowers. And they just fall as flowers around him where he's sitting. So the whole of the Mara's army is really disheartened, and they just slink away in defeat. They're just not going to be able to do anything. So the Buddha sits on and he's thinking, I'm doing pretty well. I don't know what he was thinking actually, but anyway, that's my speculation. He's thinking this is all going very well. I've seen off Mara's army. And then what happens? So these beautiful, gorgeous women come slinking up to him, not wearing very much. And these are Mara's daughters. So Siddhartha Gautama, as he is then, he's 35 years old, relatively young, a heterosexual man. And these women are really gorgeous. And they're making it pretty clear that they think that he's pretty gorgeous too. So, but he's not disturbed by Mara's daughters. He realizes that that cycle of craving actually just creates more craving, that is not the way that he's going to find happiness. So he's just not at all, his meditation is not disturbed by these feelings of craving. So the daughters give up, and actually in one version of the story, they later become followers of the Buddha and Dharmic practitioners themselves. So he's done very well. He's like seen off the army, he's seen off the daughters, but Mara has one last go. And he says to the Buddha he comes up to him and he says to the Buddha who do you think you are? You're sitting on the diamond throne where Buddhas of past eras have reached enlightenment. And you are just like a petty princeling, some jumped up boy who just thinks that he can reach enlightenment. How dare you, in a way? How dare you do that? So the Buddha just calmly puts his hand down and he touches the earth, which is like the gesture of the Buddha that we have here. So he just touches the earth. And in response to him touching the earth, this huge goddess, the earth goddess, appears out of the earth, half out of the earth. And she's able to tell Mara that she's witnessed, the earth goddess has witnessed the Buddha to be, over many lifetimes, acting with great compassion, kindness, generosity. He's got every right to be there, actually, and she's witnessed that. So the earth witnesses Gautama's right to be there. So Mara hasn't got anything else. He's tried creating anger, he's tried creating craving, and now he's tried for doubt, for really challenging. So he just slinks away again in complete and utter defeat. Though interestingly, he does come back quite a few times in the stories in the Pali Canon after the Buddha's enlightenment, which is quite interesting because I think it shows that even after his enlightenment, the Buddha was subject to thoughts that were craving, that were anger, etc., that were doubt, but that he was able to respond to those thoughts. Okay, so now the Buddha is able to enter into that state of mind, the experience under the rose apple tree. And in this state, he reflects on his experience. And what he does is he kind of looks back over his lifetime. And in fact, he looks back over many lifetimes. And he sees himself coming into being, suffering, passing away into another lifetime. He sees that happening with lots of other beings as well, many millions of beings. And he understands the laws of karma, how suffering is caused and how suffering can be alleviated. And that understanding is not just an intellectual one, but it changes him around completely. And so on the night of the full moon in May, just as the morning star is rising, he realizes full illumination, full enlightenment. And this full enlightenment, well, it goes beyond words and concepts. So it is, by the very nature of it, very difficult to describe. But I'm just going to pick out a few elements of it. So often it's described as insight, but it's not just an intellectual understanding, not just cognitive. It's a transformation of the whole of Siddhartha's being, a turning about in the deepest seat of consciousness, a real letting go, a death of the old Siddhartha, and a rebirth of the Buddha, of the awakened being. And you can, there's various ways that Sangha talks about having a taste of it, a suggestion, which I'm just going to run through. So the first is like our emotion. We experience the world emotionally, don't we? How do we experience the world emotionally? And what kind of emotions might a Buddha experience? Well, the first is a sense of bliss. Nirvana, or enlightenment, is the supreme bliss. Then there's a sense of peace, which is contrasted with the turmoil, the unrest of mundane experience. So this is a peace which is a harmony, a perfect balance, an equanimity. But it's not a passive or inactive state at all. It's not just not doing anything, but it is a very active state, but a peaceful one. And then there's very strong love and compassion. Just unconditional love for all beings and compassion for all beings that are suffering. And compassion for the fact that we're suffering because needlessly, we don't need to suffer. So the Buddha could really see that and there was great compassion for that. So those are the kind of emotional sense. Then another way we understand the world is cognitively. It's like how we think about things, how what our thinking mind is like. And this is a thinking mind which is completely awake to reality. Has complete clarity, understanding of the way things are directly, immediately. So there's nothing getting in the way of just experiencing reality as it is. And then a third way that we understand the world is a kind of volitional way. It's like our gut. You could say like the emotional is our heart, the cognitive state is our head, and then there's our gut, how we kind of intuitively feel about things, our volitional experience. And this is one of unblocked energy, complete energy, a sense of complete freedom from bondage, from limitations, from self-created limitations. So this is mysterious to us, magical even, beyond our comprehension, but hopefully one in which we can just get a hint of what it might be like. So after he woke up that early morning, after he became enlightened, the Buddha spent many weeks absorbing it. He just stayed under the tree for about a week. He walked about the space he was in. If you're ever lucky enough to go to Bodh Gaya, the place where the Buddha was enlightened, and actually I think there will be hopefully a pilgrimage maybe next year or the year after, you can go and you can see all these places and the things that the Buddha did after his enlightenment. I'm not going to go into all those stories now, but they're really worth finding out about. So after some time, he's kind of quite happy, and he's not sure about teaching the Dharma, actually, because it's not sure that people will get it. But after a while, he thinks, no, I think people will get it if I start. There are some people who will get if I start teaching the Dharma. And if I don't start teaching it, they will never get it. So he decides that he's going to do that. And he decides that what he wants to do is start with those friends that he practiced his ascetic practices with. So he travels a long way to them, and then he gives what's called the first turning of the wheel of the Dharma. So he starts, in our era, he starts the teaching of the Dharma. So he was 35 then, and he spent the rest of his life as a homeless wanderer in rags, eating whatever he was given, sleeping outside. So he didn't choose, like he did mix with kings and very rich people. I think he probably could have had a very comfortable life in somebody's court somewhere, kind of rationalizing that he was doing good there. But actually he decided not to do that. He decided that he was going to live this homeless life. And he dedicated himself to teaching his experience to others, slowly building up a Sangha of practitioners, many of them enlightened too. And it said he spent his whole life in the service of others until he died at the age of 80. Okay, so that's some of the story of the Buddha. And what might those bits that I've pulled out mean for us? So I think the first is under the rose apple tree, that experience. Actually, it's really important that our growth will come from having a concentrated mind, an experience of pleasure in the world. Not the kind of pleasure that leads us to wanting, craving more, but the kind of pleasure which is just what happens when you just are in an undistracted state of mind. You're sitting without any anxiety or craving, none of the hindrances. It's very natural. And in fact, we could live all our lives in that state. But if we continually distract ourselves, feed our craving and our anger with what we do with our minds, well, we're not going to be able to do that. And if you've been coming to these talks over the last few weeks, in fact, if you've been coming to talks to the Buddhist Center over the last few years, you'll know we always go back to spend time in nature, sit on your own, do nothing. And that's because that is the state of mind, actually, that naturally can arise in that situation. And then that state of mind is much easier to access in meditation as well. So it's just like allowing ourselves to experience that state of mind. And to experience that state of mind, we sometimes, first of all, have to sit with quite a lot of boredom, perhaps with our anxiety, unpleasantness. But there's something about having enough positivity to let that, to be with that, and then allow this first dhyana state of mind to arise. So that's the experience under the rose apple tree. So the second is the figure of Mara. So Vasantra, who's a great teacher in Triratana, he once said, basically, the whole story of things like Mara, what they explain is if you were to see the Buddha getting enlightened, you just see like this man sitting under a tree day after day, and it's kind of not much happens really. So those stories, like the Mara stories, they're a way of bringing to life what was going on in his internal experience. And so he went through, obviously, his thoughts attacked him, like with all those spears and those monsters, all those monstrous thoughts attacked him. Then thoughts of lust and craving attacked him. And then he obviously had quite a lot of self-doubt as well. There was doubt there as well. And that's just before he got enlightened as well. So I think that can give us loads of hope, actually, because sometimes I can feel a bit like I'm a bad Buddhist when I'm having those thoughts. And it's not true at all. I mean, those thoughts are part of being human, and it's how you respond to the thoughts. That is where the gap is. That's where growth is. So, but if we're having those thoughts, they're just the result of our past activity. And we can just think to ourselves, that's fine. Don't need to identify with those thoughts. I can let them go. And then hopefully they'll turn into flowers like for the Buddha. Yeah, and I also think it's really interesting that the Buddha called on the earth goddess to witness him. There's something very kind of elemental about that. It's like, it was the earth that witnessed him, and we can do that. So if we're experiencing doubt, if you can actually just touch the earth and just kind of go, actually, I'm okay. It's okay. Or bring that to mind. And I find that a really strong thing to do, actually, just think, if I'm sitting with anxiety, for instance, or fear or unpleasant emotion or doubt, self-doubt particularly, just touch the earth and just think to myself, well, actually, we all wouldn't be here if we didn't really want to do some pretty good things in the world. If we didn't have this kind of intention, whoever we might be, that we want to make the world a better place, we wouldn't be here in the room or on Zoom. And we can just think to ourselves, that is my earth touching. That is the earth goddess saying to me, you're pretty cool, really, because you just really want to do something very good with your life, And whatever else your thoughts might throw at you, you can just stick with that one. Yeah. Okay, and then I think just to, I'm getting near the end, so that after enlightenment, the Buddha spent the whole of his life dedicated to serving others and to encouraging them to serve others. And I think that says something about the nature of enlightenment, that he didn't kind of go away and, I don't know what he could have done. I guess been very powerful, he'd have been very powerful. He'd have been a very kind of, he was very beautiful to people. He was very charming. He could have thought, what I'm going to do is be very powerful in the world. But he saw that wasn't actually going to do it in the long term. And so he spent his life as a wandering ascetic, serving others. And serving others often in very practical ways as well, not just teaching. Obviously teaching the Dharma is very practical as well. But he's also famous for things, for instance, the story of the monk with dysentery. That there was a monk all on his own in his hut. He'd been left by his fellow monks there because he had dysentery. And the Buddha and his companion, Ananda, just went in and literally cleaned him up themselves, So he wasn't just a kind of standoff person, he did it himself. He went on his own begging rounds for his own alms. Very interesting what a very modest person the Buddha was, actually. Okay, so much more in the story of the spiritual death of Gautama and his rebirth into the enlightened state of the Buddha. And actually in about a month, and the full moon of May, not exactly as the first star comes up, but about that time, we have the festival of Buddha Day, which I'm really looking forward to. And we'll be celebrating the enlightenment of the Buddha on that day. And it's also a chance to hear more stories from his enlightenment. Okay,